I have quite a few mixed opinions on Gintama Rumble. On one hand, I quite like it. It offers me a lot of what I look for in anime games. But on the other hand, it's bogged down by its missed potential. It's a hack and slash game similar to Dynasty Warriors and other games inspired by it, commonly referred to as Muso games and characterized by their large multi-enemy long battles. Now when it comes to the gameplay, I have a bit of a two-sided opinion. Overall, I like the combat system. It's very simple in its design, but it feels nice to play and it's more combo friendly than I was initially expecting actually. There are three main attack buttons. There's regular attack, which is essentially the light attack, and every character has a pretty extended auto combo, therefore it's pretty mashy, and it's not like the Storm games as an example where the trajectory of the auto combo can change depending on which direction you tilt in the analog, and it's also not like the Yakuza games where the heavy attacks can change depending on how many times you input the light attacks. Although every hit does feel pretty satisfying in their own way, the controller vibrates every time you strike your opponent, and the sound effects are solid enough to leave an impact. Sounds trivial, but they do matter, especially for a meshy game like this, and I think that especially on a PS5 controller with its improved gamepad design, it feels very nice. Then there's the strong attack, which I like to view it as a medium attack, which also has multi-input hits. And what's good about the strong attacks in this game is that they have reverse beat. Now if you don't know what a reverse beat is, in fighting games, usually they tend to have a pretty restrictive combo chain. You're allowed to cancel a light into a medium and also to a heavy attack, but the reverse isn't possible. There are some fighting games that allow you to do that, such as Under Night and Melty Blood, as well as some mechanics that temporarily grant you this freedom during some kind of awakened state, like Dengeki Bunko Fighting Climax. Gintama Rumble lets you reverse beat with practically no penalties, and there are some instances where this level of freedom can be pretty helpful. For example, Gintoki's strong attack launches the opponent to the air, so if you don't want to connect an air combo, what you can do as an alternative is to just simply input triangle once, then revert beat to his light attacks. Just like that, it becomes a pretty easy way of extending your combos. Another kind of interesting example is Hijikata's strong attack, because the first hit isn't actually a hit, it's him backing away before striking the opponent, meaning that you can literally input triangle once for backtracking and cancel that with any other type of attack. Then there's the Hurricane, which I like to think of it as a heavy attack. It's single hit and it also leads to your character charging towards the opponent. Now what's interesting about this move is the fact that its utility extends beyond a simple attack. You see, this game doesn't have any sort of sidestepping mechanic, so if you want to block attacks, you have no option but to literally block by clicking L1. However, with this move, because it's aim based, you can literally use this to travel out of the area of attack that you could be vulnerable to. Granted, the travel distance isn't that big and the recovery frames are pretty bad with some characters, so in a lot of instances you may be better off just blocking, but it's interesting how this mechanic can have other use cases even if it's completely unintentional. The last out of the ones that are available at their base state is Awakening, which boosts your strength and speed. And after you accumulate enough meter, you will also gain access to the Awakening Rumble, which is basically an ultimate. Now ultimates in this game are kind of tricky, they're very easy to miss target, especially when you're not locked to any opponent. Interestingly enough, sometimes they have end cards similarly to the Storm games, which I thought was quite intriguing, although in my opinion, I think they should have been exclusive to the end of the matches or when a boss opponent dies, because they are a little bit too reoccurrent. But this is what you get when you play these characters for the first time. But as you play the game, you can also unlock different features. One of them is how many slots you can fill in for assist characters, with each of them varying in what they offer. Some are attack based assists, others temporarily boost your defense, recover your awakening meter, and much more. I would say it's important to have at least one attack based assist, especially during boss battles, as assists tend to be more effective at breaking the opponent's armor, which you can then take advantage of in order to connect the combo. Another thing you can also unlock are basic skills. You have two different ones, each of them requiring you to achieve different levels of your skill stats. The first one is activated by holding the regular attack button, and the second one is through holding the strong attack button, as in square and triangle respectively. I really like basic skills because of how cancelable they are. They don't require multiple inputs, but they do require you to keep holding the button in order to carry out the attack until the very last piece of the animation. I think the only character where this rule doesn't apply is Kondo, as for him, if you keep holding either square or triangle, instead of activating the skill in its usual time, it'll instead charge and boost the damage and range. And both skills are one hit, which makes him unique from other characters in this regard. But as for the other characters, you will also notice that the second basic skill tends to be more flexible with how liberating it is to cancel into different attacks, because with some characters, the first basic skill tends to be cancelable with the first hit, but once you start reaching the second, third, and onwards, if you try to cancel the skill, it will prematurely end with what's usually the last strike in the animation of the skill. Meanwhile, the second basic skill, as far as I've experienced, tends to be easily cancelable with almost every hit in the animation until the very last one, and this can be a pretty useful thing. Kagura is an example. With her second basic skill, she can convert it into an air combo midway through, which is great because she has a pretty strong ground strike compared to other characters. Then there's the special skill. This one is the last skill you unlock, and it has its own meter that accumulates over time, though it also dissipates over time, so it's a tricky one. They also tend to be the goofiest looking, and I love some of the references in them. One complaint I will share towards the special skills is that I think they should have added 3 different ones, each of them requiring you to combine L1 with either square, triangle, or circle. Because right now, the only special skill you do have access to is activating using either of the 3 buttons in combination with L1. But I think it would have offered even more depth to the characters if each of those 3 buttons represented their own special skill. Those are my 2 cents, but overall, I actually do like the combat system. For something that I don't think was designed to be particularly complex, it's flexible enough that you can explore some combos if you feel like testing the game's limitations, and the characters have their own unique enough playing style that I don't think they're indistinguishable. The area where I think this game starts to fall apart is in the mission design. For starters, the enemies in question are essentially just fodder. Much like a lot of Musou games, your attacks have a wide reach, meaning that you can strike multiple opponents at the same time with each of your individual strikes, and that alone doesn't necessarily bother me. In fact, the characters' movesets are largely designed to cover multiple opponents anyway, so I think it fits with the tone of the game. What mainly bothers me though is the fact that the opponents are pretty homogeneous. They're not very unique in terms of their playing style. It's not like depending on which mission you're encouraged to adapt into a different playing style. Sometimes you are, like when you have to deal with cannons and bazookas, but for the most part, they're not very unique, and even if they do offer their own distinct offensive playstyle, they will be overshadowed by how easy it is to defeat them to the point where they feel like worms. It also doesn't help that the battles tend to be like really long. The missions are usually designed in a way where they have several camps that you need to invade and capture by fighting against swarms of enemies until eventually the main captain arrives, and once you defeat them, the camp becomes yours. Sometimes it's not strictly that, you're just put in the middle of a battlefield tasked to head towards a certain destination, and to unlock the paths you have to fight against the enemies put in front of you, similarly to how I described before, because sooner or later you will be met with a camp leader. And these missions can last a pretty long time, and it's one of those situations where I feel like the game needed to mix things up by expanding on the enemy variety in order to keep us hooked. But eventually, after a certain point, it can feel pretty tiring monotonously watching the enemies around. Although this isn't as much of an issue with boss battles. Generally speaking, they are a little more challenging and they have their own unique moves. Interestingly enough, the most fun I've had playing this game wasn't through playing the regular story campaign, it was actually through revisiting previous battles thanks to a mode called Gintama Free Battle, in which you can revisit battles from the story mode, but with the extra benefit of picking whichever character you want and adjusting the difficulty, which is good not just for scaling the difficulty accordingly to your skill set, but increasing the difficulty also serves as a multiplier for the XP gain, which will help you in getting enough points to upgrade the characters. And to me, that's the main shtick of the game. It's being able to play with characters as I unlock them, learning how to use them and upgrading them to their max potential, as well as putting your own skills to the test by fighting against stronger enemies by increasing the difficulty. I mean, as of writing this script, I'm currently targeting the Kabukicho Ultimate Rumble because I want to unlock Sakamoto. And given what this game has to offer in regards to the story campaign, which isn't much, I feel like that's the only way you can realistically rely on this game to have fun. Now, I initially wanted to be generous with how I talk about the story mode because it's good to be aware of what expectations you should have for the game based on what it's trying to achieve, but I also think it's fair to tackle a side of the game that, for better or worse, can impact the experience. Now, the quality of the story mode as a whole is not very good. It's structured in a way where it cherry picks arcs in the series, mainly the more serious ones, not all of them, some of them are missing, but I guess in terms of the more popular ones, I guess it's pretty much all of the essentials, which I mean I don't really mind. Now, it doesn't necessarily do a full-blown adaptation of those arcs. In fact, it's presented in a very fragmented manner, which isn't necessarily something that kills the experience. I don't mind anime games not having story modes as detailed as Wings of Freedom or DBZ Kakarot. I mean, at the end of the day, these are meant to be video games, not frame-by-frame adaptations of the anime. But here's why I think this game does kind of fumble on a lot of its presentation. The story mode has its fair share of cutscenes that play before, after, and sometimes in the middle of the battles, which serve as contextual material, and not only can it be helpful to newbies who aren't familiar with the Gintama story and can get a vague idea of what's going on, but it can also help the people who are familiar with the series but maybe they haven't watched or read in a long time and need a little bit of a briefer, or they just want some build-up material to call back to the scenes that they recognize in order to lure them back into those scenes. Now, while I'm sure that was the intended effect, and I can think of a few instances where this was effective, if I'm being honest, as someone who has watched all of those arcs, I couldn't take those cutscenes very seriously, and it's mostly because they were just moving still frames. When I look at them, the only impression I have is that it feels like I'm watching an abridged, watered down version of those scenes that I would rather just revisit on Crunchyroll. In my opinion, what I think they should have done was recreating those scenes through CG cutscenes, because to me, that's the main appeal of anime video games. It's being able to adapt these stories that are typically animated in 2D with TV production into 3D video game cutscenes. They don't even have to always look better than the anime, they just need to be a unique visual interpretation of an existing material, and that's what this game lacks. The amount of in-game cutscenes present in the game is so unbelievably small, despite the fact that including them could have enhanced the experience even further, especially in moments where they would interrupt the match to play a cutscene. I just feel like it would flow better and improve the immersion, especially if the game also decided to include quick time events, which technically it does have, but it's one per match and it's always the same short and generic duo clash, so it's pretty negligible. Speaking of quick time events, another thing I feel like the game could have improved on is having more custom intros and hand selected lines during the matches. To give you an example of what I mean, one of the arcs that this game adapted was the Kabukicho for Divas arc. Now, one of the more dramatic moments that happened during that arc was when Jirocho slashed Otose, and Gintoki's response to seeing him was to relentlessly attack him. He had a much different attitude compared to how he usually behaves. However, the scene that plays right before the battle starts is his default intro with a snarky remark. This alone ended up taking me away from the experience, and it's strange because the game does actually have a few rare moments where they play in-game cutscenes recreating scenes in the anime, like when the Joey 4 are reunited.
人間ってやつはそう簡単に変わらねえもんらしいな。一遍死んでも10年経ってもどいつもこいつも愛も変わらずバカやってやがら。そうでもねえさ。10年前なら切ってた。なるほど。楽しみは後に取っておくことを覚えたわけか。立派な大人になったもんだ。ほざきやがれ。
Another example of good narrative implementation is during the last boss battle in the Rakyu Decisive Battle arc, in which after the QTE clash that happens with every boss battle, normally when you hit circle at the right time, you will win the clash and your opponent will get blown away. But in this battle, Kamui didn't get blown away as usual. He had his own unique animation of him pushing himself to stay up. If we had more of this in the game, I can't stress just how much life this would have brought to the story mode, because otherwise I don't see much of a point in following the narrative, and eventually after a while I just started skipping the cutscenes because they weren't offering much of value. If anything, the side stories arc was more incentivizing to sit through, because one thing they do offer that is pretty unique is the laid back and fourth wall breaking banter that plays at the beginning instead of the summaries that are narrated during the other arcs. Plus, the thought of unlocking new characters gives even more reason to want to play through that. Overall, I found the story mode to be pretty disappointing, and I quickly realized that the most fun I could have playing this game is with the alternative modes where I can crank up the difficulty. And to its credit, it can be fun, but as for the main campaign, pretty underwhelming. I might as well talk about the visuals and overall presentation. Now, performance-wise, this game seems to run pretty well, at least on the PS5 and maybe also PS4 Pro. On the base PS4, it targets 60 FPS, but it's not consistent. There are definitely times when it dips below that. Tends to happen more in crowded areas with a lot of enemies, and when you activate Awakening, this game can feel a little laggy. I've also noticed major dips when Gintoki launches his Kamehameha, although during 1v1s, it seems to run mostly smoothly, at least in my experience. But because most of the time you're going to be fighting against countless enemies, I would advise that you play this game on either a PS4 Pro or PS5. But if you only have a base PS4, then I guess the game is still mostly pretty playable, even if it's definitely not the most ideal way to play it. Especially because this is an action game and it's pretty necessary to have a smooth frame rate when playing an action game. In my case, I played on a PS5 and I have no complaints, it runs pretty smoothly. On the backwards compatible website, it states that this game is rendered at 1440p when it's Pro Enhanced, but I swear to God, I've played 1440p games in the past that look sharper than this. It's not that big of a deal though. When you play this game for long enough periods, you're not even gonna process what resolution this is being displayed at. As far as the quality of the visuals, I guess it kind of depends on what you're comparing this to. Like, obviously this is an anime game, you're a little bit of a goofball if you have high expectations for AAA levels of graphics and visuals, but you may also have a low opinion if you're comparing this to some of the better looking anime games out there, stuff like CyberConnect 2 and Arc System Works. Now, speaking personally, I do actually like the visuals. Overall, the game does a really good job of replicating the character models. Maybe I wouldn't put this on the same level as how Hinokami Chronicles nails at recapturing the art style of Demon Slayer, but even then, when I look at these characters, sure, if I put them next to the anime models, I will notice some differences. I can definitely see traces of that CG art style that kind of reminds me of some Koei Tecmo games, but I still think they look fairly accurate, and I especially love the recreations of some of the settings in the series. Where it really hit me was during the 4 Divas arc, when Kabukicho was the main battleground, and I felt pretty captivated being able to roam around this big location that I've seen in hundreds of episodes. Additionally, I was recently watching an episode of Gintama, and one of the scenes took place in Yoshiwara, and I got the chance to truly appreciate just how faithfully they recreated the building where the battles took place. Moments like these really made me almost feel saddened by how none of these locations were made into open world settings that we could roam around with normal civilians inhabiting. Not that I begrudge the game for that, I recognize that it wasn't the vision that the developers had, but it really makes you think. In terms of the soundtrack, I would have a much more positive opinion if it wasn't repetitive. After a while, I start hearing the same tracks over and over again, which is a shame because some of them aren't half bad. One of them is called Void, which bears strong resemblance to the song Take Care Buddy, and I would vibe with it more if it wasn't for the fact that it's present in every single sad scene to the point where after a while it just kind of loses meaning. The game also has a few bugs, not sure how abundant these are in other systems, but in my experience, it will sometimes mute the attack sound effects, sometimes when you have too many allies beating opponents along with you. There are also times when the subtitles disappear during cutscenes, and depending on which corner of the area you're in, this can sometimes fuck up the ultimates. Things like your character getting out of frame, or probably the weirdest one, your opponent becoming static. There was this one glitch in particular that was actually really funny, where I don't remember if it was specifically after an ultimate, but I do recall that being involved, in which Jirocho could no longer move. I'm not sure if I could ever replicate that, but it did happen once, and I guess it became a free victory since he couldn't even defend himself. I guess the last thing I would like to speak of is the actual cast. Overall, I would say that I'm pretty satisfied with what we got. We have a total of 13 playable characters, which I think is a fine number. Like, I don't expect this to have fighting game levels of roster size, and even then I've played fighting games that actually have less characters than this. And as for the ones that were picked to join the roster, I think they did a solid job of picking the ones where I feel like the game would not be able to get away with if they had ignored them. Are there some characters that I wish were playable? Yeah, I can think of a few. I wish Mutsu was playable, and I think they could have justified including her since she fought during the Rakuyo arc, and they could have even switched her as an opponent during the side stories when she got mind controlled. I wish QB was playable, but she's a little bit tricky because I can't think of any instance in the arcs adapted where they could have squeezed her in. The funny thing is that if they had adapted the Silver Soul arc, they actually could have featured her since she did fight there, but as for the arcs that were included in the game, it's kind of hard to justify her. Zenzo and Sarutobe probably also should have been included, and they were there during the Shogun assassination arc. I would also love it if the Kihetai group were also there, even if I wouldn't have necessarily ever expected them to be featured. I'm sure there are other characters on my wish list that I can think of, but in general, I'm pretty satisfied with what we got. Now, it's likely been more than a week, probably 2 or more, since I uploaded the video where I explained why I bought Gintama Rumble. But you know, there are actually 2 other reasons that I didn't mention in that video. These past few years, I've been seeing the anime licensing video game sphere shifting into a grim direction. More and more, I've been either seeing anime IPs being relegated to mobile gacha games or console games with heavy live service components. I mean, just recently, a new Persona 5 spin-off game was announced, which initially I was kind of interested in. But then, as I watched the trailer, I stared at the visual analog stick and realized, oh my fucking god, this is a mobile game. And immediately, I just tuned out. I couldn't care anymore. That was enough for me to realize that this is just going to be a bunch of gacha shit, and I don't fuck with that at all. Gintama Rumble, on the other hand, feels like a blast from the past. It does have DLC content, but overall, you're getting a largely offline experience, which is a breath of fresh air. No battle passes, no stamina system, no overly complicated skill tree that require you to obtain or purchase upgrade items, no online DRM. It's just an anime game. And I like that. Because at the end of the day, whether we acknowledge this or not, the reason why we buy anime games is for the element of fantasy, being able to control characters that you love and recognize, and you know, for what it's worth, I do enjoy controlling these characters. Maybe even more than I should. I still would have wanted the improvements that I mentioned in this video, but compared to some of the games that I've been seeing getting promoted these last few years, I feel more passionate about this game. We're probably never going to get another Gintama game, especially now when the series isn't even running, and oh my fucking god, I just realized I wrote this script before that one PV was uploaded on YouTube during its 20th anniversary. And maybe this isn't the biggest end with a bang moment that you could have after its history of largely unpopular licensed games, but you know what? Other people may not remember this game, but I do. I don't regret buying this, and I expect to continue playing this in the future. Other than that, I think that's all I have to convey. Stay safe.